Africans that were aboard were sold. Now, we have heard for a long, long time that it was 20 and on, right? There was originally just 14 Africans left on this ship. But when the treasurer arrived, there was issues. They arrived in the port, and Edward Sandys, unbeknownst to anybody on the treasurer, had issued a warrant for the detention of the treasurer because they were known that the treasurer had been pirating on the seas and with Spanish ships, and Sandys was looking into it. On September 30th, well, the ship left. It was denied access. So we have 30 Africans on this ship. Now, when it arrived in Bermuda, because it left Virginia, it could have offloaded one African. One of the Africans could have died. However, the treasurer arrived in Bermuda, and it said in the Rich papers, it talks about there was only 29, and the governor verified that 29 of these Africans were offloaded in Bermuda, and they were put what was called in the longhouse, which was basically they were keeping them there because they didn't know what to do with them. And the reason why is because the treasurer was owned by a man named Robert Rich. He was the second Earl of Warwick. And this man had lots and lots of power. He was the money man behind Bermuda and Virginia at the time. He also had a lot of allies. He had them set up in key spots. So if you look back when the treasurer arrived in Virginia, he was warned, and because of this warrant that was there, and he left. And my question was, who would have warned him and why? Well, if you really look at the people surrounding this information, Captain Tucker was the person that had received or had when he ported, Captain Tucker would have boarded. He was the commander at Point Comfort. Well, guess who worked with him, lived with him? It was his wife's brother, a man named Maurice Thompson, and he was the managing member for this port for Robert Rich. So he would have warned Robert Rich or warned the treasurer and said, you need to go because you can't get caught here. So he warned him off, and that's when he went to Bermuda. So there's a lot of people that are in this sequence, and what do? Just like today, they make up fake news, and they cover it all up. Like I said, it takes 7 days to get from Bermuda to Virginia. Why? This is the first letter out of Virginia. Why did it take 3.5 months to write a letter? The reason was they were covering it all up. And in the letter, I'm sure back then they did it on purpose and they knew what they were doing, but the people reading the letter didn't exactly know what was going on. And I wanted to point out there was, number one, they talk about that this ship was a commander named Captain Chope. His pilot was from the West Indies, one Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. Well, Mr. Marmaduke was his first name. So there's number one cover-up. His name was Marmaduke Rayner, and he was very well known in Virginia. He actually was appointed by the governor, which was Governor Yardley, to go into the Carolinas and map it out. That was a personal appointment by the governor, so you can't say the governor didn't know this man, because it's portrayed as if they didn't know who these people were, but they really did. It was all in the cover-up. So you're going to see a lot of half-truths, but really you're going to see this. Now that is really hard to read, and that's what it looked like, trying to cipher through these documents. It's nothing but a puzzle, because they were doing nothing but trying to hide the truth. Now, how did I figure all this out? As a genealogist, we do something called cluster genealogy, and what that is when you go into a specific area, you look at every single person in that area. That's how I figured out who Maurice Thompson was. He was the sister of the wife of Captain Tucker. There is so much there that you can connect the dots. But as I connected the dots, this is where I went. It wasn't just in Virginia. It wasn't just in Bermuda. It was on 5 different continents and 8 different countries. And if you notice, I want you to even look way over. You see that the star to the far left is in Japan, which you would think, originally, how on earth did it get there? But that was because of the ship. The ship came from Japan. If you look at every part of this story, it is a huge international story. That if certain parts of the story didn't happen, there's many people that would not be actually several sitting in this room, we wouldn't be the person we are today, because we descend from some of these first Africans and they would never have made it here. If this ship had not have been sold from the Japanese to the Spanish, they may not have raided the ship. So there's lots of little things that leads us to this point of how do we figure this out, but it's very much an international story. Archives all over the world. And I have to say, historians years ago, and maybe historians have looked at it and they just weren't able to be able to look all over the entire world. Because if you look just in Virginia, the story is not the same. You have to rely on, if you're looking at Virginia, that they were the 20 and odd Africans. And that was the number that was put in this document, the first letter that was written out. But they weren't. When you actually look at the entire picture, you look at archives all over the world, you will find information. We're talking primary information, primary documents. I throw out secondary information because you know what? That person that did the secondary information, someone has translated that primary document in their opinion. Just for instance, the San Juan Bautista, it had been sold from the Japanese to the Spanish. When Ingle Sluter, he actually found the receipt because the San Juan Bautista actually, the captain and the captives ended up making it to Veracruz, and in the receipt where he sold those Africans from Luanda, it's translated. Ingle Sluter translated it. He translated it into Portuguese. And at the very bottom of the document, without knowing what you're looking at, if you don't look at the primary document, you think that ship is Portuguese, but it wasn't. In the very bottom, he notes, I have translated the information specifically about the captain and the ship into Portuguese from Spanish. So that changes everything. Now, I want to kind of tell you how, in this journey, it's been 13 years, I've spent over 20,000 hours. I put documenting at 20,000 because it's like, what's the use? It's ridiculous. But during this process, there was many, many times when I would get frustrated and say, what am I doing? I am spending all this time on this information. Why? Why am I doing this? Well, number one, I had this voice inside of me, which most genealogists, if there's genealogists in here, they know. You have a driving force behind you. Your ancestors are pushing you to find the truth. And that's what I couldn't get out of my head. Margaret Cornish, who was my husband's ancestor, she was driving me crazy. I would be, I don't know, if you've never been to Florida, I-4 is probably like, it's probably 2 times, it's a huge highway. It's twice the size of 65, 64. It's like a 10-lane highway going one way. And I would be driving from point A to point B down this highway, and I couldn't tell you how I got there. I was literally involved in my head with this woman. She had taken over. But as I went along, I had said several prayers, and several things happened to me to kind of push me along. And one of them I want to tell you about is this painting. In 2010, I started talking, in December of 2010, I started talking, or I should say, I started looking for a cover for the first book that I started to write. And I wanted a ship because I wanted it to represent the Battle of the San Juan Bautista. Well, the actual picture that I found on the internet was painted by the same gentleman, Richard Moore, and I called him and said, hey, can I use this painting for my books? I told him what my books are about. He goes, nope. I'm like, oh. And I said, I really, really like this painting. Are you sure? And he's like, well, the problem is, you're talking about a different kind of ship than what's in the painting. I said, oh. I had no clue. So we started talking. I told him everything I knew about the ship. And he says, you know what, I need to call you back. So I didn't hear from him for a day. He called me back and he said, you know, I really feel like we need to paint a painting. And I said, okay. He goes, well, here's the real reason I feel that way. Whenever I hung up with you the other day, I had to go talk to my wife, because it turned out when he talked to his wife descended from the same exact man that commissioned the ship in 1613. She was Japanese. There was little things like this every time I turned around that kept me going, that would push me down that road to get me farther and farther. Well, from there, I went so far as to, I have found all of their names. We know their names. Originally, it started out, this is what it looked like. Those names come off of the 1623, the list of the living and dead from 1623. And I've added a few because there were a few that came that weren't on that list. But this is what we know them as now. And it starts with Anthony and Isabel and William, and I'm thrilled that Shelton and Dimitri are here today. They're Tuckers that descend from these original ones. But these are the original names that we have. Every one of them, and I want to talk about their status. In 1619, when they arrived, they were not slaves and they were not indentured. They were maritime contraband. They were stolen from a ship. And when contraband is stolen, it's not theirs to sell, number one. Well, within a year of their arrival, there was a huge lawsuit in England. And it was between Robert Rich, who was the owner of the treasure, and it was also between Gondomar, who was, his name was Sarmiento de Acuna. And he was the ambassador to England, the Spanish ambassador to England, and he had the king's ear. They were very much, they would banter back and forth about all their information. He had a huge library. But the king really got along with him, and so he had his ear. He was within the king's inner circle. So these two went at it. So with a court case that's active that the king knows about, slavery, there's not a single law out there for slavery in England. How is the governor going to enslave these Africans when the king of England knows about this, everything that happened? There's no way they could have enslaved them when slavery was not legal in England. But to further my point, by the time there was three things that happened that changed. In 1626, Gondomar dies, the Spanish ambassador. 1627, Governor Yardley and the Cape merchant Abraham Piercy dies. Now in 1628, the early January, I believe, we see their will and last testament. And in it talks about, it has three specific categories. And he says he wants all of his property sold, and I'm referring to Governor Yardley. I have a copy of his will. And it talks about, there's three categories. It talks about chattel, it talks about servants, and then he has Negroes. They are not in the same category. So he had them sold. Now, all of his indentured servants were sold because they had a contract, and that was basically a commodity back then. So with that being said, 7 years after his will has told them to be sold, we find them being released from indentures. So they went from maritime contraband, then they were indentured in 1628. In 1635, they're released, they become headrights. We find them on patents. Then 7 to 10 years later, they own land. They own servants, both English and African. So there's no way that they were slaves is where I'm going with this. And their accomplishments are huge. During this time, and I've had a lot of pushback on this, I'll just tell you that right up front. In 1622, there was a native uprising that killed a third of the colony. Now there was only 1,200 people in the entire colony, which was 80 plantations up and down the James River. In 1622, this native uprising, in response to it, the Governor Yardley made all of these people go into 8 plantations to make a solid defense, because the natives were continually trying to kill them. What they were doing was trying to push, they had gone across the river on the south side, and they were trying to push them back across on the north side, because the south side, that's where their croplands were, and they were encroaching on that, building houses where they couldn't have their crops anymore. So the natives were trying to push them back across the river. And in doing that, that's why this native uprising happened. But as these 8 plantations held all now of the Virginians. Now, on these 8 plantations, there was only one with the Africans on it. Now, yes, there was a few Africans here and there, like Anthony and Isabel were at Elizabeth City, but at Governor Yardley's plantation, which was Florida, there was 14 of these Africans. Governor Yardley's plantations was one of the 8 plantations. It was a 1,000-acre plantation. It had enough acreage for these Africans to grow crops, to raise livestock, and to basically feed the colony. And the reason being is because if you look at the 8 plantations that were left, that they used for a solid defense against the natives, you can see that some of them weren't big enough to even grow crops. And then there's documents that shows they were starving. So these Africans, if you look at the list of the living in 1623, that first one that I mentioned, I looked at every single person on there. Between 1619 and 1624, 4,700 people had come from England. 4,600 had died. The Africans had survived. And if you look at who had survived, the English who survived, where they came from, there you can actually see a lot of them came out of the prisons in England. You can see what they were charged with and why they were sent to America. Some of them were orphans, but they didn't have the knowledge to grow crops. They didn't have the knowledge to raise livestock because they were off the streets of England, most of them. So during this time, it was the Africans' knowledge that they brought with them from Angola that allowed Virginia to survive during this 2-year period. Without them, I honestly do not believe that Virginia would be what it is today. I think we would be South Canada. So, what were their accomplishments? Number 1, they fed and provided crops, fruit, and livestock for the settlement for Virginia to survive. Between November of 1619 and February of 24, like I said, 4,739 arrived and 4,600 died. They had the knowledge. They maneuvered through the English legal system. Every time they sold something, even if it was to their own children, it was recorded in the legal system. We can still find that in our public records today. They were cattle barons, they were carpenters, they were planters, they were legal guardians and legal representatives. Benjamin Dahl, who was in Surrey County, he was a legal representative for a white woman in the 1660s, which is amazing because 1661 is really when slavery really became legal, right? They also made sure that their descendants were free. You remember how I said John Gowan, Margaret Cornish's husband, basically took the child from her? The reason being, he was a smart man. He was also knew how to get through this legal system. He went in and indentured the child immediately. But because the child had been born and he didn't have an indenture. His mother did, but he didn't. So his father had the foresight to understand what was coming because he was very much into the legal system. So he went and indentured his child. That indenture gave his son an end date to his indenture. Therefore, he could not be enslaved as slavery evolved. So that was a really good thing. Yes, it was a harsh thing for the mother, but it was the best thing that could happen for that child. Now, 42 years after the Africans landed in 1619, laws began to be put in place to enslave the Africans that were brought here. With each legal step they made, within a year or so, there was something put in place by the English to stop them from being able to do what they did to maneuver their way through it. What the hard truth is slavery for English America began on English soil. It was not brought here slavery was not in existence in England at this point, and it was an English colony. And that's a hard truth to know. Now, I have been a truth seeker for quite some time. There's two people that every time that I do a presentation, I think. One of them is my husband. He has been my muse. He has, for 13 years, I have not made hardly any money on doing this, because this is what I have focused on, 8 hours a day for the last 13 years. All of my focus has been put in this, and he has allowed me to do that. So I have to thank him every time I do that. The other person I want to thank is Calvin. Because I met Calvin, I don't really, it's been so long I don't remember what year it was. But he was really the one that was the catalyst behind this, pushing for the truth, because the truth matters. So I always thank Calvin very much for what he has done. Now, he asked me not long ago, he goes, I know you're kind of, at the end of this journey that you're going, but what are you going to do next? Well, I said, I have started something called 1619 Genealogy. I actually started it 2 years ago. It's a DNA data bank. I initially started as a private DNA data bank. I was just accumulating DNA with descendants who can actually find the paper path. Once you have the paper path, I allow these people into the DNA data bank because we can prove what their ancestry was.